everyone, I'm Stephanie Weaver. Welcome back to the Blue and Yellow Kitchen. In each episode, I make a dish inspired by a new book while talking to its author. Today's book is Annie and the Wolves, and I'm making rabbit stew with cream gravy. I'd like to welcome Andromeda Romano-Lax, author of Annie and the Wolves. Welcome, Andromeda.
Hi, Stephanie. I'm a fan of your show.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here and for writing such an amazing book. Tell us briefly what the book's about. Let's start there.
Sure. Annie and the Wolves is about a down-on-her-luck modern historian named Ruth, who finds her life increasingly intertwined with that of her subject, Annie Oakley. And this is a novel that ends up looking at questions of revenge, whether we can change the past, and even what we can do in the present, because there are issues that are happening in this historian's own community, and she is trying to prevent possible violence from coming to her community. The novel takes place in a small town in Minnesota.
Great. So what inspired you to write this story, and how did you choose the setting? Because it goes back and forth between Annie Oakley's time and kind of present day.
Yeah, so the origin story is a little complex. There's actually two different parts of it. First of all, I didn't know a lot about Annie Oakley, and then I stumbled upon a footnote. A lot of my novels come from footnotes. And in this footnote, it explained that Annie Oakley, who came from a poor family, her father died, she was living with many siblings, and her mother couldn't afford to take care of them all. Her mother sent her off first to an infirmary, and then Annie was sent to live with a family on a farm, and they were supposed to educate her and pay her, but they didn't. She was about ages 10 to 12. They essentially held her captive for about 2 years. And later in her unpublished autobiography, she would refer to them only as the wolves. So they abused her, at least physically, possibly sexually as well. And I became fascinated in discovering how that early trauma contributed to the person who Annie Oakley became later. She was an amazingly strong, resourceful businesswoman, and I was interested in those two sides of Annie Oakley. So that's the historical piece, and then there's a personal piece, and I'll keep it real short because I want to talk about food. But at the very same time, just by coincidence, my father was on his deathbed, and I had not had contact with him from about the age of 14 when I found out that he had sexually abused my two sisters. When we heard from relatives that he was dying, one of my sisters was considering paying him a visit, perhaps even with a gun. She didn't end up making that visit, but that whole question of what happens when someone has a revenge fantasy, what's going to happen, what was my role as a sister in terms of protecting her, that all ended up coming together with the Annie Oakley piece and making me fascinated in these stories of trauma and resilience.
Yeah, so that's there's definitely some heavy material in this book, but I thought it was super important because that's a real thing that happens in a lot of families, and so thank you for sharing that, and thank your sisters for giving you permission to share that, because I know we talked about whether or not you were going to be public about their story, and so but the book is not heavy all the way through. It's so beautifully written. There's so much going on. And is there anything else that you want to tease that readers should know to prepare them, or do you want to, because we don't do spoilers on the show, but is there anything else you'd like to prepare people?
Sure, I will just let readers know there's that historical piece, but really more of the story happens in the modern day. It becomes a mystery and thriller because this historian is trying to understand a mysterious journal, and she is also becoming involved with things happening in her own community, as I said. So there's a thriller element as well.
Yeah, and it's also beautifully woven together, so that's what really captivated me. I love how it weaved back and forth in time. There's some stuff about her potentially having seen Sigmund Freud or one of his acolytes in Vienna, which I was completely unknown to me. I didn't know anything about Annie Oakley except having heard of her name, essentially. And so that was why I chose the book. So then the recipe I'm making today, Annie was a highly skilled sharpshooter, and she hunted rabbits most of her life, from what I understand, for the table, which my father also did during the Depression. It is not easy to shoot a rabbit with a rifle, so it kind of attests to her skill and also the real kind of hard scrabble existence that she faced. So I did do some historical research, and while I couldn't verify that this is a recipe that Annie might have eaten herself, it is from the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, and it's from the Trail Boss's Cowboy Cookbook. So I did make, I made it with some great ingredients that they would have had available to them, like bottles of beer, although they would not have used gluten-free beer like I did. And I also used, instead of vegetable oil, I used bacon fat, because my assumption is the Trail Boss would have had a nice big can of bacon grease, and any kind of fat that they had would have probably been that to start with. And also, rabbit is a very delicate game meat. It doesn't have a ton of flavor on its own, and so any way that I could add flavor and build flavor in the dish was something I wanted to do.
Can I just express gratitude? I think the fact that you researched this recipe is so cool and just wonderful. It's perfectly appropriate.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, and I've never made rabbit before, so part of what I'm doing this season is I'm challenging myself to make things I haven't made before, either create new dishes for the books or to really, understand a particular cuisine or a country's cuisine, depending on the book. So, anyway, that's how I chose the recipe. I've asked Andromeda to prepare a short passage, which once she reads it, you'll kind of understand why I chose it. And while she's reading, let's see if I can bring the story to life by finishing off the pan gravy. The rabbit should be cooked. I'm going to show it to you when she finishes reading. And we'll talk about the recipe after she reads. So go ahead and set up what you're about to read, and then go ahead and read it for us.
Okay, so I've explained about Annie and her relationship with this couple, the wolves. But I'm not going to include any spoilers. You just have to understand that this is a scene of confrontation. This takes place in 1871. I will him to turn and look over his shoulder. I even dare to push my toe into the snow-dusted roadbed to make a little scuffling sound as I hold my breath. But he is engrossed in his task. His collar is turned up. His black-brimmed hat is pulled low over his red ears. He is muttering to himself, all the luck. He will turn and I will say, you shouldn't have done it. I hate you for what you've done. He'll look angry at first, surprised by my presence here, then incredulous at what I'm aiming to do, then afraid. But I can't think about that, because when I imagine too much, my stomach gets weak. In all my years, so many feathers, so many exploded puffs of fur, so many bloody paw prints in the snow, so many glazed eyes and skinned bodies, the flesh always redder and the body smaller than one would imagine. A rabbit's body, all muscle. When we are flayed, we are all so much smaller than one would think. Dead and skinned, we're all such little things, hardly worth the ground we stand on. Better to pull the trigger without him looking. Let him turn and look as he falls. But just as I feel the pressure mounting, ready to pull, I slide out of time again. Back to the wood stove, next to Mrs., late at night.
Oh, I love that passage so much, and you read it just beautifully. So I chose that partly because of the rabbit, partly
it's
because...
a little serious. It's a little bit of a serious
Yeah,
passage.
it's a serious passage, but it really ties in with the recipe, because one of the things that we, like I said, I've never made rabbit, and they're small, and they're also, ironically, they're incredibly expensive to buy if you don't live somewhere where people are, producing them readily. So I didn't want to ruin the dish either, but it's very true. There's not a lot of meat on them. You can tell they're all muscle, and so that was partly why I chose this particular passage. So I'm going to show you a little bit. So I'm going to show off the rabbit. So is that about right?
I'm okay. So eager to see this.
Okay, there's the rabbit. So the rabbit's been stewing for about 2 hours. The idea is you want to cook it what they call low and slow. So you're braising it in the beer. So I started with the bacon grease, added the onion. The recipe will be on my website, migraine-relief-recipes.com. There's bay leaves. One of my tips is anytime a recipe calls for bay leaves, I use 3. and that way I always know how many to pull out, because you don't ever want to serve bay leaf to someone because it'll catch in their throat. And then there's a little bit of ground cloves and ground allspice and salt and pepper. So it's a pretty simple recipe, but it really adds so much flavor with the 2 bottles of beer.
I think anything with bacon and beer tastes good.
Yeah, so what I did was I pulled, while you were reading, I pulled the meat out and I turned up the heat. So now the braised liquid is bubbling. And so now, and then I also stirred in some milk into the 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. So now I'm going to put that in, and you want to kind of stir continuously when you do that so you don't end up with lumps. And you want to cook any cornstarch based sauce for at least 3 minutes, because you want to cook off the starchy taste. So that's another tip. And I'm going to show you, I know that I'm over on the stove, but I'm going to show you in a second kind of what this looks like. Let me go ahead and, while that's starting to boil, I'll ask you a couple of other questions.
Sure.
So did any aspects of life inform your fiction? I know you talked about your father and your sisters, but anything else? Like, do you like to do historical research the way your lead character does, or kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm always drawn to history, and my previous novels were historical novels as well. So I've written about a Spanish cellist, an Italian art curator, 1920s psychologist, and in this case, Annie Oakley. And then another personal element is that I was actually born in Chicago, and I think you were too, Stephanie, or you lived in Chicago?
I lived in Chicago for 15 years, yep.
Yeah, and I went to school, actually I was raised in Waukegan, went to school in Lake Forest, Illinois. So this is the first novel that I've set in the Midwest, and that's where I was raised.
Great, that's awesome. So this is, the gravy's starting to thicken up. Now, yesterday when I made it, I only used 1 bottle of beer, so I ended up using more milk to kind of get the right thickness of the gravy. This isn't, it's called a cream gravy, but really it's a brown gravy with the creamy elements. I did use whole milk because they would not have had any reduced fat milk back then. And I'm letting it kind of boil a little bit. So tell us a little bit more about your writing process. What kind of, do you lay out your whole book? You plan it out in advance? Or are you what's called a pantser, where you write, just kind of see where the story takes you? This is a pretty complicated story, so I'd love to know more about kind of how all that came together.
I would definitely say I don't know the whole story in advance. And in fact, that's how I know when I'm on the trail of a good story. If it's about a historical person, it's often better if not too much is known about them, because then that gives me more dramatic license. But also, I'm really motivated by curiosity. I usually have a question or a problem, something where I don't know the answers. Chekhov said you should be able to frame the question, but not necessarily the answers for your reader. So I often start off with a burning question. In this case, it was a really personal one. It was about questions of revenge and recovery. If I knew how it was going to turn out, I think I would get too bored and I wouldn't manage to finish even that first draft. And Stephanie, I was thinking about this just today in reference to cooking, because I was thinking about how curiosity leads me, and I want to be surprised, and I don't want to know how it's going to end when I start. But when it comes to cooking, I'm clearly not an artist, because with cooking, my hope is that I can make the same dish over and over and over again and get the same results, that it's predictable. I imagine somebody who's really creative with cooking would be willing to take those risks and know that sometimes there's going to be failures and not know how it's going to taste in the end.
Yeah, I think that's something that for me, as I've evolved as a cook, and certainly recipe development, the 10 years that I've had my food blog, I always initially started with base recipes, kind of like I did for this one, and I would renovate them. My original name of the blog was Recipe Renovator, to make them fit my dietary restrictions. But part of what I've learned how to do, and as you get more confident, is say, see something at the farmer's market and you say, ooh, let me make a recipe from that. And then I come home and, look up what might go with well with that, kind of what inspires me. Maybe I tasted something at a food festival 7 years ago. Maybe I can recreate that in some way. And so, so for this, like, for example, I knew that rabbit, while it's a game meat, is a pretty mild tasting meat. And so I wanted to make sure I was building a lot of flavor. That's why I went with the bacon fat.
I see more parallels there with writing. That same feeling of what can I do with this? What can I make of this? And even getting inspiration, like you said, maybe you're trying to replicate something else. Being inspired by other people's novels. For example, I'm really inspired by novels that have that complex structure, different timelines, different things coming together where when you start the novel, you really don't know how they're all going to come together, and that's part of the pleasure of bringing in all these strands. So I like how you said that about food as well, all those different ways of thinking about it.
Fantastic. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just plate up one piece of the rabbit, and then the gravy's still a little bit thinner, so I would probably cook it down a little bit farther, but just because we're shooting, I'm going to go ahead and finish this off. So I'm going to pour a little gravy here. Let me show you again. Whoops.
Yeah, I can see it
the
just a little bit.
Terrible. There we go. So, so I'm going to pour a little gravy on there. So you can see the gravy's a little bit on the thin side, but it does thicken up as it sits. It's such a pretty color. And then they, kind of surprisingly to me, called for paprika, which I would not have expected trail bosses to have, but I'm going to sprinkle a little.
About Annie Oakley, she was quite fussy about her own food. She made her own clothing even when she was a performer in this Wild West show, and she was fussy about her own food. I don't know specifics of what she would eat and not eat, but that was part of her sort of controlling persona, that she knew what she liked.
So I just taste a little bite. Yeah, it's not any really more tender than it was yesterday, but that's not bad. It's just a closely textured meat.
And small game, as you know, is something that Americans really relied on. I mean, in her time, she was out there as a child hunting for her family and then also selling the meat to locals. She was doing this as a child to keep her family fed.
That's fantastic. Well, that's fantastic to know that. My dad and my uncle, so they grew up in the mid to late 1920s, and they would go out and hunt rabbit and squirrel for the table when things were really tight. So I certainly, when I was reading the book, was remembering, my dad's rifles in the closet, and not that he hunted much when I was a child, but him telling those stories. So certainly, I thought about, my grandmother maybe making something along these lines. And it is incredibly tasty. So the meat is a little on the sweeter side. I would say the texture is of like a kind of a firm fleshed chicken, and the gravy has this super rich. The beer is kind of layered notes, but it doesn't taste beery. It doesn't taste like bacon either. It just tastes like a really rich meat gravy. I love the addition of the paprika. Now I only have smoked paprika in the kitchen because it's like my favorite spice, but so that adds a really nice texture. And also I'm just going to bring it forward so you can see just how pretty that looks with the paprika on there. You'll find the recipe link in the Facebook video or on my website, migraine-relief-recipes.com. Learn more about Andromeda at Romano-Lax.com, and if you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend. You can order a copy of Annie of the Wolves wherever you like to buy books. If you aren't able to buy books, you could still support a local author by asking your local library to order their book. That really helps with sales. Follow me at sweavermph so you don't miss an episode, and join us next time for another author interview and a dish inspired by their book. Thanks so much for watching The Blue and Yellow Kitchen.